Good morning. I'm Dr. Matt Rudolpher, Chair of the Washington Psychiatric Society Continuing Medical Education Committee, and I'd like to welcome you to this morning's special event, a collaboration between the Washington Psychiatric Society and the World Psychiatric Association. You know, on Sunday, I saw the Beach Boys concert at Wolf Trap here in Virginia, a great show at which they reprised one of their classic lines about springtime impatience, quote, "We're waxing down our surfboards. We can't wait till June," unquote. While you'll have to go surfing on your own time, today we can't wait till nightfall here in the Eastern US when we have the CME equivalent of the perfect wave right here in the morning sunshine. So it is my privilege and honor to introduce our first distinguished speaker. Dr. Enrico Suardi is Director of Psychiatry at St. Elizabeth's Hospital here in DC and President of the Washington Psychiatric Society, a diplomate of the American Board of Psychiatry and Neurology in Psychiatry, Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, and Forensic Psychiatry, and a Fellow of the American Psychiatric Association. He is on the psychiatric faculty at St. Elizabeth's Hospital, Georgetown University, and George Washington University. He's a professor at the Institute of World Politics, IWP, and has served as Chief Child and Family Psychiatrist at the U.S. State Department. Dr. Suardi completed his MD and a residency in preventive medicine in Milan, Italy, and obtained a Master of Science degree in public health and policy from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and an executive MA in National Security Affairs at the Institute of World Politics. Dr. Suardi's timely presentation this morning begins our program in Diplomacy and Psychiatry. Take it away, Enrico.
Well, thank you, Matt, for the kind introduction, and welcome everybody. I am speaking to you from my office at St. Elizabeth's Hospital. This is an old psychiatric institution in Washington, D.C. It will be 170 years old next year. And I'm Director of Psychiatric Services here. As you said, this is a collaboration between Washington Psychiatric Society and the WPA, and particularly the Conflict Management and Conflict Resolution section of the WPA. And this is also, the material that I'm presenting here is also part of a course that my colleague psychiatrist, Dr. Baiju Gandhi, and I will be co-teaching at the Institute of War Politics in Washington. And Baiju has graciously agreed to be the discussant here, and will add his remarks at the end of my talk. But for me, this is really a tribute to Gian Domenico Picco, also known as Gianni Picco, who was an extraordinary international civil servant, diplomat of the UN. He recently passed away in March of this year, and his story should be known and has to be told, deserves to be told. So the first part of my talk really is a profile of Gianni Picco that is based on his autobiographical book, Man Without a Gun. As an assistant for political affairs to the UN Secretary General Javier Pérez de Cuellar, Picco negotiated the Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan, the end of the Iran-Iraq war, and the rescue of hostages in Lebanon. Now, in the second part of my talk, I will use some of his insights and pivot to discussing peacemaking from a psychological perspective. And that's based on another book that he wrote, actually co-wrote with a psychotherapist, a psychologist, Gabriel Rifkin. And it's The Fog of Peace and the Human Face of Conflict Resolution. At that point, I will introduce the concept of multi-track diplomacy and highlight the past involvement of the American Psychiatric Association in Track 2 diplomacy processes. And I will make the case, and this is really the point of this talk, that as psychiatrists interested in international affairs, we have something, we may have something useful to offer in terms of advice to policymakers. So it's nighttime in Beirut. on August 10th, 1991. An envoy of the UN Secretary General, Gianni Picco, is at the embassy of Iran. The Iranian diplomats have arranged for him to meet with the groups who are holding Western hostages. His mission is to negotiate with them, with the kidnappers, the release of the hostages. That night, he will have the first of a number of encounters with these groups. Nobody else will be there. The Iranian diplomats have been very clear. It's just between him and them. And there are a few formalities they've told him apologetically. So what happens next is that he's left outside the gates of the embassy with no further instruction. He sees a man in a distance and starts walking towards that man. When he approaches the man walks away, but remains close enough as if he wanted to be followed by Picco. It goes on for a few minutes. Eventually, a car arrives at high speed. Stops. The people in the car shout at him to not look at them, shove him in the back seat, force his head down to the floor. And it's all quite inconvenient, besides being scary, because he's a tall man. He's over 190 centimeters tall. He's 6'4". Now, the car seems to drive through checkpoints, eventually stops. He's pulled from that car, thrust into another car. And then after another drive, the second car stops and a hood is slid over his head. And he's taken to a place, to a room where he meets with two individuals who wear ski masks. And one of them introduces himself and will do all the talking. And what you will realize later is that these two individuals are probably Imad Mughnieh and his brother-in-law, Mustafa Badreddin, who are leaders of the security apparatus of Hezbollah and manage the kidnapping operations. This is the tail end of the Lebanese civil war, during which an estimated 17,000 people have been abducted and have disappeared. And about 100 of them are foreigners. And these hostage rescue operations by the UN envoy that he's executing focuses on 11 hostages. 7 are Americans, 2 from UK and 2 from Germany. And I have, you see their names listed here. They will all be freed with no ransom paid at a total cost for the UN of approximately $150,000 just for manning this almost year-long operations. Now, the US covers 25% of the cost of the UN, right, at that point. But that quota will be charged to a separate fund that was donated, had been donated in 1980s by an American private citizen to the UN Secretary General's office. The point here is that the American taxpayers will pay nothing to have 7 Americans return to their families. And some of these freed hostages suggest to the President Bush, to recognize the work of this UN envoy, Gianni Picco. And so he will be given the Presidential Award for Exceptional Service. Actually, Mrs. Bush, the First Lady, will place that on him at the end of that year. Now, the mission of Picco is freeing up the hostages primarily, but that's not the only objective. It also involves recovering bodies, or at least forensic evidence, or finding proof of life of a number of individuals who are missing in actions and prisoners of wars. And some of them I have on this slide. It's also about liberating other individuals who are detained in different countries, or making sure that there is access to them, or improving their conditions of detainment. And some of them I have on this slide. The objectives and the tasks for the UN envoy keep changing. There is a lot of inventorying and packaging and repackaging that goes on for months as this operation unfolds. And there are multiple quid pro quo and reciprocities that keep changing. And this UN channel is just one of a number of channels that are more or less active to free hostages. There are multiple players involved. It's a complex game that unfolds in the Middle East, in America, and in Europe. And needless to say, there are complications. There are complications all the time. There are rogue intermediaries, there are hoaxes, there are rumors, media intrusions. Also, the UN envoy is operating on a time crunch because his boss, the UN Secretary General, is stepping down at the end of that year, 1991. And a new Secretary General will come in probably with their own priorities and plans and their own people that will want to work with. So the envoy has little time left, and this is a de facto one-man operation where he's putting all of his skin in, and he's keeping it a secret even from his family. And no one in his office in New York at the UN knows what he's really doing when he's absent, and that's often the case, absent from the office. Nobody except his boss, the UN Secretary General, and his own administrative assistant, who usually books 3 flights at the same time for him. And then when he is at the airport, at the last minute, he cancels the flights that he doesn't need, and he gets on the flight that he needs, so that people can't really know where he's going. So let's see a little bit, who is this guy? Who is this remarkable fellow, Gianni Picco? So of all places on earth, he comes from a village in the Eastern Alps in northern Italy, in the province of Udine, right here. That's where he grew up. It's a village where, it's a place where half of the people were Catholics and half were communists, and that was not an unusual scenario during the Cold War in Italy. It's a place that, as you can see, is much closer to Austria and the former Yugoslavian countries than to the capital of Rome, which is not even in this map. It would be down here. It's a region steeped in a history that features empires and kingdoms, a melting pot of ethnicities. He goes to school for undergrad in Padua, a very old university, and he studies political science. And then he goes to a very new university at UC Santa Barbara for a grad school in international relations. And then he goes back to Europe, but this time to Amsterdam for post-grad European history studies. And right out of school in 1973, he joins the UN at the lowest rank in the Department of Political and Security Council Affairs, also nicknamed at the time as the Soviet Department of the UN, because a Soviet national is always in charge, and that's part of the Cold War arrangements at the UN. As he says, he's young, he is inexperienced, and expendable. And therefore, they give him an impossible task, one of those impossible tasks. Right? So the task is to create a daily digest of the international press. Well, except that nobody is happy with what he does, no matter what which topics he decides to cover, no matter which words he chooses, there are two camps there. There's the pro-Soviet, pro-Western camp, and it's polarized in that Cold War environment. So he has this thankless job for over 2 years, but he does learn important lessons. For example, the politics of terminology, and also the reality of living under some kind of surveillance, being potentially subject to blackmailing and recruitment attempts by intelligence agencies. But his aspirations are different. He joined the United Nations and became an international civil servant because he wants to make a larger contribution, both in intellectual and practical terms. Therefore, he's able to move to the UN Office of Political Affairs that is in charge of the peacekeeping operations. This is a department that was staffed in its early decades by legends like Brian Orchard and Ralph Bunche. Now, his assignment is in Cyprus. He is sent there to mediate the conflict between Greeks and Turks after the partition of the island. And he will spend several years there, really learning the ropes of this international mediation work, dealing with the people's everyday problems. And in the end, he will consider this mission a failure for various reasons, but with some important lessons learned. For example, that credibility and accountability are key, and the individual comes first, and that pride can prevail over money, and that 90% of diplomacy, as he says, is about who blinks first. But the other very important, very consequential fact of these years is that he forms a close professional and personal relationship with his boss in Cyprus, that is Javier Pérez de Cuéllar. And Pérez de Cuéllar in 1981 becomes nothing less than the UN Secretary General. And he will continue to work for him. Pico will continue to work for him, but obviously at a much higher level. So among the dossiers that are entrusted by the Secretary General of the UN to Pico are the negotiation of the end of the Soviet-Afghanistan war, the end of the Iran-Iraq war, and later on the hostage crisis in Lebanon. In Afghanistan, Pico learns very useful skills to bargain in the bazaar because he likes to buy carpets. So he goes to the bazaar a lot, and that's a learning opportunity. He also acquires high-quality socio-political insights from an unexpected source, we could say. That's the chaplain of the Italian embassy, Don Panigatti. Don Panigatti has spent 2 decades in Afghanistan at that point, learning the language and really understanding the tribal reality. So knowledgeable that he could rival intelligence agencies. Afghanistan will be mission accomplished for Pico when the Geneva agreements sanctioned the withdrawal of the Soviet Union in 1988. And this is all based on guidelines that Pico had jotted down on airline stationery back in 1982. So the lines that he wrote that day in 1982 will become paragraphs. The paragraphs will become chapters. And here we will have there will be this document that is signed and becomes effective in 1988. This is UN peacemaking at its best. There are no money, no weapons that the UN secretary, through his envoy, can offer. They're using intermediaries. They practice the shuttle diplomacy a la Ralph Bunche. Ralph Bunche, the first African-American man Nobel Prize winner, the Nobel Peace Prize winner in 1950 for the mediation of the Arab-Israeli conflict. He often cites the work of Ralph Bunche Pico in his books. It's about pursuing pragmatic solutions in unconventional ways, if needed, but never by upstaging governments and authorities. Now, the second big dossier is the negotiation of the end of the Iran-Iraq war. This will also be a success story for Pico and the UN. That bloody war started in 1981. After many attempts, in 1987, the UN Security Council passes a resolution to end the war. But the resolution does not go into effect, and the war goes on. And so early in 1988, Pérez de Cuellar asked Pico to come up with some new idea. And right after that, a good lead materializes. The defense minister of Saudi Arabia gives an interview in which he says that his country is tired with this war. Now, this is a very important signal for those who can listen, because the Saudi kingdom at this time is the banker of Iraq, is the banker of Saddam Hussein. And so Pico thinks in historical terms about the role of bankers in funding wars. He goes back to the Renaissance. And the idea then is to negotiate the ceasefire between Iran and Iraq using the Saudis as the proxy of Iraq, of Saddam Hussein. And so on August 8, 1988, Resolution 598, the ceasefire resolution of the UN Security Council, becomes effective. And I want to make a note of paragraph 6, because I'll mention it soon, paragraph 6 of this resolution. Mention it soon in the context of his next big dossier, that is the hostage crisis in Lebanon. So his idea here is that the key player who may lead to the rescue of the hostages in Lebanon is Iran. And that's because Iran created and sponsored in South Lebanon the Party of God, Hezbollah, which is the umbrella organization under which operate these groups involved in the kidnapping and hostage taking. So the UN Secretary General, of course, does not have money or weapons to offer to anybody, but has credibility as his currency. And the credibility comes from having successfully negotiated the credibility with Iran in particular comes from having successfully negotiated the ending of the Iran-Iraq war. Pico realizes that he has two cards to play in this game. Now, the first card comes from this paragraph 6 of Resolution 598. Here it is. This is the Security Council requesting that an inquiry be conducted into the responsibility of the war. Who's responsible between Iraq and Iraq for this war? And Pico suggests to the Iranians that 3 wise professors will look into the matter, and they will likely find that Iraq was the culprit, right? And that's very important for the Iranians to have historical justice, the recognition that Iraq was the aggressor. Iraq that was actually supported by both superpowers at least in the beginning in this war. That's his first card to play with the Iranians. The second card comes from a paragraph in the inaugural address of President Bush Sr., the 41st president of the US, in January 1989. President Bush mentions in his inaugural speech the American hostages held in Beirut, in Lebanon, and calls for Iran's attention, stating that goodwill, remember, goodwill begets goodwill. right? So that statement is very important and is the second card that he has to play with the Iranian. If you do something good, you'll get something good, right? And so with these two cards, it's game on, and it will take a lot of shadow diplomacy in the following months. We're talking about 1991 here. Now, his idea is to go to the sponsors first, like he did with Saudi Arabia and Iraq. So he goes to Beirut, but coming from the east, coming from Tehran, the capital of Iran, and then Damascus, the capital of Syria, because these countries are sponsors of the Hezbollah in South Lebanon. And he will go to Israel, but coming from the west, from Washington, of course, the sponsor. Now, the Iranian president at that time is Akbar Hashemi Rafsanjani. He is the scion of a wealthy merchant family, and Pico understands the man as a pragmatic man. He's the descendant of business people. He's not a cleric. He can grow a beard. He has a reputation to be pragmatic. So we can make a deal with him, right? And also he has a good understanding of the inner workings of Iranian politics. For example, the fact that different centers of power refer to different religious authorities. So religious authorities really matter. It's a theocracy. And then the historical reality of centuries-old ties between the Shia authorities in Persia and South Lebanon, the connections that are personal and philosophical, theological of the Iranian and Lebanese clerics are very important here, where they did their religious studies, who were their teachers, who are they close with. And it all matters because the clerics have powerful influence on the political and military operatives. And so with all these, and to make a very long story short, this is a success. It results in 11 Western hostages freed from Lebanon, but also 99 Lebanese prisoners freed from Israel. And the bodies of U.S. Marine Corps Lieutenant Colonel William Higgins and CIA Beirut Chief of Station William Buckley are returned to the U.S. And other remains, forensic evidence are produced. And this is just part of what he accomplishes in this year-long mission. Now, Iran does get the favorable UN reports that attributes the responsibility of the Iran-Iraq war to Iraq. When it comes to goodwill begets goodwill, President Bush, through his national security advisor, Scowcroft, doesn't give anything. The political conditions do not allow that. And that's just about the same as the amount paid by the US taxpayers for this operation. But that's the political reality. And, if goodwill begets goodwill, the lack of goodwill does not beget goodwill. Now, Gian Domenico Pico has been a giant in the field of negotiation and international conflict resolution. And sprinkled around in his writings are pearls of wisdom. And I've collected some on this and the next slide here. I'm going to go over I'll go over them quickly. And human factor is the basis of crisis. The individual is the source of solutions. Now, this is in the title of my talk today, but it's also the inspiration, in a way, for the work that I've been doing for the course that I alluded to. And this means that, bureaucracies are slow to react. They tend to be stuck in precedents. The time to make changes never ripe. And this is why it's best to go for the individuals. Choose individuals over institutions. Aim at their personal commitments. Understand what really matters to them. And knowing where they come from, where they want to go, where they think they're going. Nothing happens really according to plans. You're always, as a negotiator, you're always picking up threads and weave. You need to try to stay off the radar screen as much as possible. So work quietly, and you're always running against time. And operations unfold on the jobs, not in the books, not according to what's in the books. Negotiators, therefore, have to be prepared to act in unconventional, fast, adaptive ways, act a little bit like semantic acrobats, but always be credible and accountable. Take risks, but always calculated risks. And assume there will be irrational behaviors because there are very strong emotions, and there will be changes that are not foreseeable. And it's like a matryoshka, negotiations within negotiation. International negotiators should never embarrass or upstage governments and authorities. Remember that pride can win over money. Pride can win over money. And power politics often prevail over other considerations, economic and humanitarian. I have to be aware of the existential necessity to have enemies, the existential necessity to have enemies. The human species is an enemy-creating species. And know that the mindset of war sees difference as a threat, and yet difference should be and could be the essence of growth. And peacemaking, according to Pico, is life at its peak. Life at its peak. That's the end of his book. And it's a word pun because the word peak in Italian is Pico, and he's Italian, of course. So, but there can be a personal price to pay. There is a personal price to pay. And in the prologue of his book, Pico apologizes to his son for his repeated and long absences due to his work. And after an emotional climax, life usually goes downhill. Now, individuals accept easily the responsibility for success, but they also must accept the responsibility for defeat. And they have to know when it's time to leave. And the time to leave for Pico, leave from the UN, comes in 1992, when he resigns and becomes an international consultant and author. And in 1999, he publishes Man Without a Gun. That is the book that I've used for this profile. And then in 2014, he co-authors The Fog of Peace, the Human Face of Conflict Resolution, where he combines his own practical intellectual experience as a diplomat with the psychological expertise of Gabriel Rifkin. The book really highlights the importance of personal and collective narratives of victimizations in international relations. These are mental constructs that stem from personal and collective histories. The psychological mindsets of those who are involved in conflicts have to be understood as the products of the personal experiences, but also the history and culture. Pico and Rifkin maintain that war is perpetuated by the failure to manage the humiliation of defeat. Those who live in conflict look for a safety blanket. And so they take on collective identities that can be ethnic, religious, cultural. They, in a way, sell their individualities to others in exchange for a sense of safety that is false. Civilized societies are governed by laws. They devise systems of arbitration and reconciliation so that we can coexist. But in conditions of heightened tension, we are driven by rigid beliefs about identity and survival. And as part of large groups, we become consumed by the group's history. We identify with collective earlier traumas. Vamit Volkan, the psychoanalyst who has written and worked so much in this area, has referred to chosen trauma, the chosen traumas. The baggage that we carry matters when we make decisions. That's the kind of baggage that does not allow opponents to see a negotiator as impartial, no matter what the negotiator does. So impartiality, neutrality are illusory concepts in negotiation. What's key is to be credible. A negotiator has to act as an honest broker, has to deliver what they promised. Conflict is more likely to be resolved when the geopolitical complexity is placed in a bed of human relationships, And conflict resolution is better served at the kitchen table, said Hans Blix, the Swedish diplomat who was foreign minister of Sweden, and among other things. The kitchen table, not even the dining room. Huh? We need to maintain awareness of geopolitical structures and power politics. Politics is not therapy, cannot be therapy, but human motivations and emotion should always be part of the strategic equations. And we must learn to empathize. And empathy is not the equivalent of sympathy. Empathy is about trying to understand where the other person is coming from, why they think and do what they do when they think. And it's not about appeasement. The field of conflict resolution originated in the mid-20th century as a discipline, as an academic discipline. In 1981, Dr. William Davidson, who was a psychiatrist in Washington, D.C., and Joseph Montfield, who was a U.S. Foreign Service officer, introduced in writing the term Track 2 diplomacy. And they define it as unofficial, informal interaction between members of adversarial groups of nations with the goals of developing strategies, influencing public opinion, and organizing human and material resources in ways that might help resolve conflicts. In 1996, Louise Diamond and John McDonnell developed the concept of multi-track diplomacy. They identified 9 tracks to engage various governmental and non-government actors in peacemaking activities. In addition to these terms, the term Track 1.5 diplomacy, also known as back channel, is used by analysts to describe situations where official and non-official actors cooperate in conflict management, operating under the instructions of government officials in that case. So are these multi-track, Track 2 diplomacy just freelance, feel-good exercises, or can they actually deliver unconventional solutions in unconventional situations? This is how Track 2 diplomacy works. Unofficial representatives who are open-minded, altruistic, act as third parties. They run small, informal dialogues, like problem-solving workshops. The participants in these problem-solving workshops, dialogues, agree to step back from their country's official positions and jointly explore underlying causes and alternative ideas, while they maintain some kind of access to the official decision makers. These are ongoing processes rather than one-time events. They're not secret, but they are quiet. And the thinking is kind of an outside-the-box thinking. New approaches are discussed, not only between groups, but within the groups. And participants will try to change the perception of the others, but they're also open to an extent to changing their own perspectives. And psychological aspects of the disputes are addressed, they're front and center. So new channels of communications are open. New options for future official negotiations are identified and developed. Networks of influential people are developed. But the final goal is always to prepare the ground for the transition of the ideas to the track one, the official diplomacy, which is government to government, state to state. So these are laboratories to test ideas, policies, especially where the official routes are blocked. An example is the work done late 80s and early 90s by the American Association for the Advancement of Science, which, organized a series of these workshops, conferences, and this led to actually to the Oslo Accords between Israelis and Palestinians. Foreign policy emerges from a nation's perceptions and misperceptions of itself and other nations. Policymakers and psychiatrists should have the same goal. They should work toward mediation and resolution of conflicts. In 1931, as part of an initiative of the League of Nations, Albert Einstein wrote an open letter to Sigmund Freud. And Einstein asked Freud why there is war, warum war, warum Krieg, why war? And he asked why there is war and what can be done to prevent it. And Freud responded that aggressive instincts are inherent to the human condition. But Freud also thought that aggressive instincts can be redirected. In 1969, Senator William Fulbright, who is known around the world for the Fulbright Scholarship, at the time as chairman, was chairman of the U.S. Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And he held a series of hearings on the psychological aspects of foreign policy. And in one of these hearings, he stated, "It is believed by many that wars start in the mind of man. Yet an examination of the human mind to understand our own political behavior has not appealed to either the public or the political leaders. It may be that we are frightened by the possibilities that might be revealed by some self-examination. We are frightened by the possibilities that might be revealed by some self-examination." In 1977, in a historical turn of events, the Egyptian president Anwar Sadat addressed the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, and he stated, "There remains another wall. This wall constitutes a psychological barrier between us. It's a barrier of suspicion, rejection, fear, deception, hallucination." And in the same speech, Sadat said that that's 70% of the problem. In 1969, the American Psychiatric Association founded the Task Force on Psychiatry and Foreign Affairs. It was chaired by Dr. William Davidson, the psychiatrist I've already mentioned, the one who put in writing the term track to diplomacy. Subsequently, this APA task force became a standing committee, and it remained active through the 1980s. It was focused on the Arab-Israeli conflict, but also other world conflicts. The World Psychiatric Association was founded after the end of World War II, and psychiatrists coming from countries that had been at war with each other worked together to create the WPA. Fittingly, the WPA Conflict Management and Conflict Resolution section was created after the end of the Cold War by Dr. Sorel and others, Elio Sorel and others. As psychiatrists were interested in world politics, it would be great to contribute to developing psychologically minded empathetic approaches to international relations. It would be great if we could offer our advice to the subject matter experts of diplomacy and statecraft. For example, in the context of track 2 diplomacy processes. There is an initiative now at the APA proposal to have a new caucus on peace, conflict, and psychiatry, initiative of Dr. Kerry Belkin and many others. So perhaps there is an opportunity to do something similar to what was done by the APA back in the 1970s, 1980s. Now, conflict is part of the human condition. It's ubiquitous, it's universal, it's intrapersonal, it's interpersonal, national, and international. It manifests in particularly stark and brutal forms when it comes to the international arena. It cannot be negated, cannot be avoided or eradicated, but it can be at times ameliorated. And so hope and hard work in the pursuit of peace should never cease. So what in the end? Well, I'm offering 3 quick thoughts here. First of all, this shouldn't be a grandiose dream. As psychiatrists, we're not the diplomats, we're not the policymakers. We don't have, we can read as much as we want. We don't have, that's not our trade, okay? And also we have ethical obligations that are quite strict when we think about the Hippocratic Oath, right? But we are equipped as psychiatrists to be facilitators, to be advised, and I would say that we are adequately equipped for that. The second thought is to go light on theory. I mean, we have some wonderful psychodynamic and cognitive theories that apply to these areas of work. But, my impression is that the diplomats, the policymakers are not terribly interested in our theories. And so let's be light on theory. And that shouldn't be difficult because we, as physicians, we are hands-on people. We're down to earth. We are confronted every day with the humbling reality of working with patients and in systems that are fragmented. And we know very well that sometimes what we can do is life-saving, other times is barely palliative. And we are doers. We meet our patients where they are, we say in therapy, right? And we have a basic toolkit that can be useful. The de-escalation techniques, the active listening skills that actually, FBI negotiators use.